Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And we have another excellent episode for you guys today. We had on a good friend of ours named Adam Korzeniewski to talk about everything from war to Hamiltonian economics to all of the crazy stuff that the Democrats got away with the census this last go around. It was a fantastic episode, but before we get to his bio, I want to encourage you guys, as always, to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find information about upcoming events that we have. You can read things on AmCanon and just in general learn more about what we're about. It's constantly updating. And also, we have a pretty deep podcast backlog now. If you have been with us since the beginning, well, thank you. But if you only joined in, say, episode 15, there's still 15 pretty good episodes before that you can check out as well. We have been going on a pretty steady clip for a while now. I can't believe it's been more than 6 months of us doing it. So be sure to check it out if you have any long drives ahead of you from final summer trips. Someone tweeted a couple weeks ago that they were very grateful to us for having 6 hours worth of podcast content for them to consume on a road trip. We are more than eager to furnish you with said content.
I can't even imagine listening to our voices for that long. That just sounds like grating on my ears.
Yeah, my loved ones really have a number done on them every time we go on a road trip. But anyway, with that, we'll go now to our guest for today. We have Adam Korzeniewski. Don't bother asking how to spell that. It's very Eastern European. He is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, and he was educated at Columbia University. He has a background in military intelligence, technology, politics, and finance, and worked at a hedge fund before working in politics and startups. He was an appointee in the Trump administration in the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department, where he was working at the Census Bureau. He's a subject matter expert on basically everything under the sun. I've never had a conversation with Adam where I didn't learn something, but very specifically financial policy, trade and industrial policy, national security, and the census itself. He is a wealth of knowledge. He's a great follow on Twitter at RealAdamK if you would like to follow him there. And we had a wide-ranging conversation on everything from what's going on with the Afghanistan withdrawal, his experience serving in the military and being deployed to Afghanistan as a signals intelligence officer. He transitioned to broader neoliberal economics and the issues with it, and how he thinks we can draw from the past to go forward. And then we went deep on the Census Bureau. And if you're at all even a little bit of a math nerd, or you find political apportionment or redistricting interesting, there you are in for a treat in the last third or so, because we get deep into what imputation means, what group block imputation is, and all of the financial all of the mathematical wizardry that the Census Bureau got into to make sure that the Democratic Party kept as many of their seats as possible. So I thought it was a fantastic episode.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. I'm going to recommend, if you don't know what the word imputation means right now, please look it up before starting this episode, because it gets used a lot. But I learned more about the Census Bureau than I think I ever knew previously, especially the way that these supposedly independent organizations can be used as political cudgels to enforce the will of the Democratic Party. So definitely make sure you stay tuned all the way to the end.
And now we'll go to Adam Korzeniewski. Howdy, Adam. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We always like to start with how our guests got to the point where they are now. You've had you've worn a lot of different hats over the course of your career. Walk us through how we have the Adam Korzeniewski we have today.
So, long story short, after high school, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. I did 5 years in the Marine Corps, deploying to Afghanistan twice. I was a signals intelligence operative for a brief moment right afterwards. I worked as a defense contractor, and then I started going to school at Columbia University. After school, I worked in finance for a brief period, and then started working in politics. Donald Trump became president. Obviously it's huge energy, big league, and I wanted to be in part of it. It's like that was the big thing that was going on at the time. It was a life-changing experience for me watching that happen. And so I got more serious into politics. Eventually one day I was running congressional campaigns, and then one day I just wanted to kind of take a break. One of the things that's really not fun about doing professional politics is the sales role, which is you're constantly having to do it all the time. So I decided to take a break and take a job up with the Census Bureau. About a few months into it, I was running part of Queens County. I had thousands of people underneath me. One day I get a phone call, and it's one of the ones from the White House operator number. It's a really weird number with like all zeros at the end. And they asked me if it was James Bacon from the White House, and he's like, can you come in this weekend to interview? At first I didn't believe him. I have a much more profane way of explaining that story, of, like what I said to him. He emails me from an official government email address. I interviewed there, and then I get a job with the Trump administration. January 20th rolls around, we're out of office, and so now I'm here.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so let's rewind a little bit back to your deployments to Afghanistan. You know, I've been seeing a lot of people involved in the discourse on Afghanistan over the last couple of weeks, and I think we've seen that a lot of people's minds have changed on this issue. Can you kind of walk us through how your opinion has evolved over time on Afghanistan, you know, between serving and then after being out of the Marine Corps?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated to explain, because at one point, you know, I joined the Marine Corps to fight in the war on terrorism, and basically that's what I got to do. So I really wasn't interested in like the liberal interventionist, change the world, save them from themselves type of shenaniganry that we're familiar with, especially in the Twitter sphere. However, so when I first going to the Marine Corps and we're about to deploy to Afghanistan in 2010, there was a huge, you know, it was part of the surge, and so like our primary role was combat at the time. But you know, there's already starting to be this inkling of this liberal narrative of like how we're there to build schools and like, you know, change things. And you know, one of the things that was very characteristically different from Iraq, at least the tone and tenor of Iraq deployments from when I saw people going back and forth from them. I was supposed to go into Iraq in 2009, but they drew down the deployment, and I was too new for them to be like to allow me to go. And versus Afghanistan was supposed to be almost explicitly a combat type of deployment, whereas Iraq had a lot of what's called the 3-block war, which, you know, one block will be, you know, hardcore combat operations, next block will be humanitarian operations, and the third block would be like security, governance, and economics. And so, but you already started seeing the rhetoric build up at the time. But so I deployed to Afghanistan, and you know, for the most part at the time, it was like still very much a combat role. I come back and then I go again to roughly the same place, and you're already starting to see a totally different tone of everything. It was still a very hot environment in terms of combat operations, but you know, there was a lot more State Department flunkies running around, and like not like the cool ones who are actually working for the CIA, but the actual State Department people, civil affairs, military civil affairs, that is, and all that jazz. And they're starting to talk about building schools, building hospitals, and things like that. And I was just like thinking to myself, after walking through a field of like 6-foot tall poppy plants, I'm like, we can't even convince people to not grow poppy, like, you know, not make and process and refine heroin. Like, how do we convince them to send their kids to school? It was one of the most absurd things. So, and then years later, as I started getting involved in politics, I once upon a day was talking to a former lieutenant governor of the state of Massachusetts. Her name doesn't really matter because I don't know if she's had a career after that, but and she was talking about why we're in Afghanistan to educate women. And it was just struck. I was like, that's such a weird thing to say. But come to find out, that was, you know, their reason for actually having us in combat.
What was it like to obviously be motivated to join the military, in part because you thought that we were fighting a just war for just reasons, and then to sort of come to realize that it wasn't what it was sold to people as? I mean, this is why I think you see a lot of, especially members of Congress that have served, tend to be some of the most hawkish members, is some of it just is to avoid any kind of cognitive dissonance, because I'm sure it can be hard to you know, see your friends die in the battlefield and wonder if it was worth it at all.
So you gotta, like, you have, for members of Congress especially, you have to really draw the distinction between people actually served in combat and people who just had combat deployments. So I was on Newsmax yesterday, and there's a representative whose name I won't name drop, just to be a gentleman about it, who was talking about his reason why we should stay in Afghanistan, and how a variety of things like air power could have made the difference with the Taliban, etc. And I looked up at this guy's Wikipedia, and he was so senior by the time the war on terrorism began. He was already largely an administrative functionary. He was already, I think, either colonel or general by the time the war on terrorism began. And so, there's a strong distinction there versus someone where there's a lot more authenticity with, like, the combat side of things, like a Tom Cotton. Tom Cotton being an infantry platoon commander, or whatever the Army calls them. I think platoon leaders. Like there's a degree of difference between those, especially if you see the rhetoric that they're saying. But the hawkishness is kind of weird. But this is part of this liberal imbibing of these neoliberal narratives of how we need to change the world, make it safe for international capital to go into places. We'll probably get to that later, but it's very unusual. But if you think of the military as a conservative institution, you'll be surprised. But the more senior you go, especially in the officer ranks, the less conservative people become, less America first conservative. They become more neoconservative, if you will, just because they're more interested in using military force to accomplish social aims.
I think this is a very interesting point. Semper Fidelis, by the way. I was born just off base at Pendleton. My dad is a Marine. He would smack me upside the head if I ever said was a Marine.
Oh, there you go.
That's kind of the way it goes. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that that's not what the Marine Corps or any other branch of the military, quite frankly, is for. It's not for, this peaceful, liberal internationalism, building institutions so we can, like, teach women why trans pride matters in Afghanistan or whatever. They're meant to defend the citizens of the United States. I mean, how do you see that having changed over time? I mean, even since you served.
Right. So the change has started before, probably mostly in McNamara's day, the Secretary of Defense for Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
But World War II was also, people don't realize there were social experiments with the military, precisely because of the progressive era, using it as kind of this way of, like, using it for social promotion. It didn't work out in World War II because they had a world war to fight. But they don't stop trying because it's the administrative state, the bureaucracy. These are largely people who are ultra liberal in their mentality that actually enforces intra-departmental policies. So yeah, I mean, it's changed. It changes a lot, especially during the Obama administration, which I primarily served under. You had the progressive creeping of progressivism, like progressive morals, not just the administrative policies, into the military during that time. And so you ended up having a military that's much more, I hate to use the word woke because it's been so overused, but the things that are colloquially used for woke are what was called social justice warriors, as becoming these major reasons for military bureaucracy. And it does become disconnected with combat. But philosophically, where the disconnect comes from is that the military is relied on to do so many things that's really not politically purposeful, right? And this is the big thing. Like, I had a small argument with a representative recently, and he was like, "Oh, you can't use politics to determine military aims." I'm like, that's actually the point of a politician, is to engage in the political, right? The military is under civilian rule, so it's like if you just defer to the military every single time, then you get, like, all sorts of absurd consequences because the military has to report aims and objectives and oversight to the civilian side. Mm-hmm. So, like, you're basically deferring your own oversight role to the military, which is not supposed to do it. So they're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again until someone else comes and says something. And so, as a result on the ground, what you have to train for in a variety of different ways becomes endless. Everything from, people talk about, all this like all this racial awareness type of stuff on in the military. Well, that's part of the thing you have to train for, because that's like a function of the military. You have to train for gender awareness. You have to train for it for the stateside and abroad. For the foreign customs abroad, you have to train to engage in type of police action, solving and being intermediaries for local tribal conflicts. You have to learn how to like do maneuver and fire and maneuver. So if you're like trying to assault and take an objective, you have to do all sorts of extra stuff on top of it. And what ends up happening is you start missing out on the purpose, the mission, which as a national security strategy, the mission of the military is to defend the nation. But once you get down to the ground, then it's like it becomes whatever the situation requires you to do. And that's that disconnect is so wide that people don't understand that.
Did you see the precursors to the woke stuff while you served, or does it feel like it accelerated around the time people tend to note these things accelerated, 2013, 2014?
Yeah, so definitely 2013, 2014 was when I first really became aware of it. Like I came out of the military pretty libertarian, and quite quickly I got snapped back to reality. And I got to see kind of this woke stuff begin when I started going to school, and I got to start meeting actual policy decision makers. They're largely let off the leash by especially during the Obama second term. I remember I actually met Dr. Jill Biden at Columbia, and I was just like surprised that she's actually very aware of veterans issues, which is really quite nice. And she had a really nice sentiment about it. But what it was being back channeled into the military at the time was surprising to me. And that was the rise of the online social justice warrior type thing. Especially as you roll from 2014 to 2016, a lot of this really accelerates because they have now their great enemy, which at first was Brexit and the European right, and then it became Donald Trump, who was like their version of the same thing. And so, or at least in their head.
I was going to say, I wish.
Right. Well, to some extent you do, but some extent you actually don't. But we can get into that later. But the reality is that they basically started going on this moral crusade, and they actually really imposed it. But I remember the most shocking point was during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, and I use air quote repeal because a repeal, Don't Ask, Don't Tell would mean that you'd go back to the things where being gay was just straight banned, whereas it's actually just a change in the rules. So like for the most part, like people in the military don't really care that much. It's like even religious conservatives don't care that much. Like it's the question actually becomes, what does that mean for policy? And I remember in Marine Corps we had the assistant secretary for the Air Force, or undersecretary for the Air Force, a Marine general, and some other bureaucrat come to like a small panel of us randomly selected to ask questions of them about this policy thing so that they get feedback. And this Marine major bravely stood up and asked the question. He's like, I'm in charge of a small unit. He's like, I'm in charge of also the barracks. Like, what is the policies that are going to be implemented for people who aren't comfortable for having a gay roommate, or like, what if like there's some like, or how are we going to manage it? Is there going to be policies? Is that unit level? And the assistant secretary or undersecretary of the Air Force at the time under Biden, or not Biden, Obama, same difference. He stood up and he's like, well, if you can't figure it out, Major, maybe you shouldn't be an officer. And like basically the whole crowd went nuts, because that wasn't even the point of the question, is that whether or not there's going to be a top-down policy, or how does that actually get implemented? Because the policy was a radical overnight change. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that the people in charge of the bureaucracies actually just don't care, that they just expect you to shut up and listen, and there's no feedback. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. Like, I'm surprised that people are surprised that Afghanistan collapsed. I was like, like, where were you this whole last 20 years? It's the Afghan army wasn't going to be something that stands up to the Taliban long term.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy seeing some of these statistics. My source is Twitter, FYI, ahead of time.
Right.
But seeing some of these statistics about like how well funded, the Afghani army was compared to the Taliban, and like all the weapons and support that they had. I mean, if you were a betting man and you knew nothing about Afghanistan, like I feel like most people probably would have bet on them, and it was mere days that they collapsed.
So yeah, there's a lot of layers to unpack, so I'll try to go through it quickly. So first of all, Afghan is the noun, is the person. Afghani is the currency for all those on Twitter who keep screwing up. No offense, but
it's all good. I've never been to the Middle East.
Yeah, so no, it's no worries. I don't know if I've actually ever seen Afghani currency.
Yeah.
So like, for what it's worth,
because it's not real.
Well, I mean, like, it's as real as you make it, right?
Yeah.
That's the
so the same as the US dollar.
right.
Okay.
But like, I'll also fight back on the gold bugs about that. But so just like high level, where was that 90-day assessment that the Afghans are going to collapse, or the Afghan army could last about 90 days, right? Well, it's actually really a logistics and procurement process. Who's going to buy bullets for the Afghan army and then ship them into Afghanistan? It's like, well, we don't know. Like, there's the central authority in Afghanistan was so weak that they probably couldn't procure equipment for their units out in like the hinterlands of Afghanistan. So like the collapse was kind of this thing that they were just like, well, these guys can't even like get food, beans, bullets, band-aids for their own troops. And so there was some degree of expectation that they're going to collapse. But this is the thing is, so the Afghan army had about 350,000, well, on paper had 350,000 men under arms. And then there's all these other Afghan security forces. So possibly there's like 400,000 men ready for combat, hypothetically speaking, in Afghanistan. Well, anybody who's been on the ground will tell you that's like pure hypothetical. It was like, I didn't have to manage the patrol of Afghans, but I know people who have, and I was on patrols while we were patrolling jointly with Afghans. They would forget equipment. They would forget weapons. They would sell equipment. They would sell weapons. They would show up high. Sometimes they wouldn't show up in uniform. Like, and they would, sometimes some of them would break, like if they took too much combat without Americans present, like, for what it's worth. Like, I don't know. I wasn't there. If I'm not there, I don't know what the circumstances of them running are, but there was just no esprit de corps. There was no unity. There was no central command that was able to keep everybody in place. And the Afghan government is kind of it's a bunch of PhDs from Columbia University that are running it. It's like, these aren't inspiring men, who are going to get people to go to war for them. And so it was kind of a paper tiger, maybe not even a tiger, but like one of those like large tabby cats you see running around Afghanistan. And so it was not a real fighting force in terms of like a normal fighting force. And so it was very easy for the Taliban to go through, surround, destroy the couple pockets of resistance. And there's probably mass defections. When I was in Afghanistan, you'd have Afghan army and police commanders talking to the Taliban local commander on the phone, because they would try to like have gentlemen's agreements of like not having to fight each other and things like that. And so they probably just like straight up texted a dude like, hey man, we're gonna surround you and kill all your friends, or you can just like go home. And people are like, yeah, I'll go home. Like we talk about the new Afghan rebellion force. It's just a civil war. It's been a civil war since 1979. But this new rebellion force that's been created, basically the Northern Alliance Part 2. Well, like, if you're somebody who's dedicated to defeating the Taliban, why would you stand and fight with the Afghan army when you could just like go with where all the other fighters are going, So like they also took probably numbers out of the Afghan army. It's just not a practical, realistic fighting force. And so even though the Taliban numbered between 50 and 75,000, hypothetically, how many of those are actually combat troops? Like, how many of them were there? Like, the Afghan army could have stayed and held, in place with or without Air Force. Like, that's a total cope. People have fought wars before there was air power, and in fact, like, one of the bloodiest wars in human history, World War One, was almost done almost completely without air power. You could just dig trenches and have it out for decades potentially, but they didn't. And that's the reality of it, is that the Afghan army wasn't going to hold.
So Tucker has a great quote, which is that it seems like the purpose of the American military at this point is to make the world safe for banking. What do you think the financial incentives are, not just for the war in Afghanistan and its continued endurance, even as an entire new generation of people was born who were never there for the start, but also American foreign policy more broadly, being everywhere all the time, causing destabilizing events and enriching military contractors?
Yeah, so it's a very good point, and the only reason why I don't like directly attack banking is because it becomes like this mono company culture, right? It's like the banks and the certain companies that are involved heavily in international trade, like Nike, and the Coca-Cola, for example. Coca-Cola has energy drink plants in Afghanistan. Like, like some of the best energy drinks I've ever had are Afghan halal energy drinks.
I do want to say that when we walked into the studio around 10:50, Adam was drinking a Monster.
Right. Well, so I get the complaint that I talk too slow, so I figured I had to up the manic energy for this. So so anyways, but these companies, they have a financial incentive to have a liberalized system here or abroad. The financial institutions want certain abilities to go and perform whatever type of financial role. In Afghanistan, it's probably more merchant banking than any sort of like true investment banking. But like that's a large part of the what has been called the GAE by Darren Beatty. It's like, it's really not American. So it's because.
Can you explain for our listeners what GAE stands for?
It's the Globalist American Empire, but the thing is, it's not an American thing. No one says the Globalist Chinese Empire, right? It's more.
But that's really what it is.
But it's like, it's not American though.
Yeah.
It's an internationalist clique, right? It's like, it's a group of people who predominantly live in these major financialized cities, New York, London, Hong Kong, etc., who are engaged in kind of this international capital. They seek to profit from kind of being intermediaries of exchange between different nation states. And they largely just don't care about the actual day-to-day functioning of a country. And so like, that's really part of the drive for Afghanistan, probably a softer drive than say like a place like Iraq was, because Afghanistan, there was a military objective at one point, Al-Qaeda, which we supposedly destroyed. I'm pretty sure we did. I didn't see very many Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but I was in Helmand province. Like, we didn't really even have Haqqani network, and it was just like straight Taliban. But so like, there is this meta drive for an American intervention across the globe, and that's the thing, is like, anytime there's already been an intervention, this becomes part of the issue du jour of like continuously pushing Americans and American interests into this country further and further, and not pulling out, and like not accomplishing military objectives, accomplishing social objectives. And there's this dunk out there about people saying, oh, we can't turn Afghanistan into a Jeffersonian republic. Well, the United States isn't a Jeffersonian republic either. So like, that's that's the other half of the joke, is that we have a federalist system. We have this national identity. We're not this perfectly agrarian nation state. And like, no one wants that. No one wants to basically be an easy colony, right? And so whether that's, whoever it is, you have to, when you're doing military intervention, you have to seek some sort of military objective. Otherwise, it becomes this thing that, master students from top universities are trying to change the world for ambiguous purposes.
Yeah. Well, if they want to be a perfectly agrarian Jeffersonian republic, the poppy plant seems like a great source for their farming needs.
Absolutely.
But this takes us to another thing that you've been really influential on us, and I think speak very concisely about, which is the sort of loser economics that the right has championed for a long time. You wrote a piece in Revolver News that was excellent. It was called "Against the Loser Economics of the GOP Establishment: Cold Turkey on Neoliberal Addiction." You were at the U.S. Treasury during the Trump administration. You have worked at a hedge fund on Wall Street. You actually know what you're talking about when it comes to this sort of thing. What was the basic thesis of the piece, and how do you think about economics more broadly?
So, I guess both to answer both is that there's this concept called free trade, and it's a concept. It doesn't really exist in the real world. The trade is a consequence of norms, of this is like real Aristotle hours right now, but norms, laws, traditions, and also agreements. Like, these are conscious decisions. Like, trade does not just happen in a vacuum. In fact, it's not a natural state of man. Like, natural state of man is some sort of feudal system. Afghanistan, the Middle Ages, pre-Columbian Americas, etc. Like, these are things that are sophisticated. Trade is a sophisticated, national and international trade is a sophisticated concept that requires an advanced system of laws, property rights, all these things. And so when you're a nation state, it's more business school than it is like economics, right? And this is the thing, that there's this huge disconnect. People in economics classes learn free trade's great. It becomes like it's a liberal version of the libertarian love fest of like, oh, we can trade with anybody, and where materials don't cross borders, armies do. But that's not the reality. Like, liberal democracies are some of the most warlike countries and since they've been around. And it's not just because of the economics, but it's downstream from this neoliberal or liberal economics theory of trade is a universal good, and that there is a profit motive for actors in an economy that does make it good. And this is where libertarians get it right. Where they get it wrong, and also conservatives and Democrats, like everybody is a neoliberal basically in this city. Where they get it wrong is the collective action problem, where, like, as a polity, like, you benefit from prioritizing your own people more over interested foreigners, and it's incumbent upon you to negotiate how trade actually is conducted between your polity and other polities, right? The only thing that prevents 40 families from running the globe is the fact that there's borders, nations, popular elections, etc. And that's the thing, is by removing these boundaries, these cultural norms, and like allowing everybody to vote, allowing nobody to vote, because that's what our system kind of is trending towards, is that absolute mass enfranchisement regardless of citizenship, as well as the inability for elected leaders to actually influence the system. So like the administrative state, these deep state bureaucracies. So the reason for this stuff is precisely because it opens up and prohibits restrictions on international trade, international finance, and all that stuff. And so that's basically the long and short of it. So, but in terms of the benefiting of a country, there's almost no reason why you should engage in unlimited trade, because there's political reasons why you are a nation, why you're in charge of a country, and why you're supposed to look after it. And it's the China problem that we're starting to see. This is where kind of like the America First thing actually made a beachhead, is that people are like, oh wow, like China is a serious global competitor. It's like, just because the Cold War kind of put a temporary end to history of great power struggles doesn't mean that now that there's going to be none of those. In fact, we're like, these aren't countries. None of our allied countries are perfect allies, right? They have to look out for their own self-interest. They're going to look out for their self-interest. They are competitors as well in the global market. And so, we have to, as a political grouping, the political right, we have to start realizing that we have to be competitive too. Right? We have to have economic systems that are competitive, or we're just chumps and we just want to get beat up on the street corner.
Yeah, I mean, this is why like Canada should not want to have free trade with us regarding maple syrup. Like they should just be making it in their country, not buying it from us, right?
Well, so it's a little Canada, Australia, countries like that, New Zealand. It's really difficult because you're talking about countries that are inordinately smaller than the country that they're to put it politely, their suzerain. And so, Canada's in an interesting position where they both have the United Kingdom and the United States as like historical long-term trade partners.
It was just the first example that came into my head of like something that was in the national interest to produce in your own country, maple syrup. You can tell what's on my mind.
Right. But it's like it's the problem with Hungary and Poland, right? Is that like as nationalistic as they are, they're still largely sort of like they're bigger satellites, but they're still like satellites of bigger countries in the European Union.
Yeah. So in the past, you contrasted a lot of these, neoliberal or libertarian economic ideas with a Hamiltonian vision of economics present since the founding. Can you tell us a little more about, what exactly that is, why Hamilton's thinking around economics are still relevant today?
Yeah. So, Hamilton was faced with a country that didn't have a lot of money and that we were very likely to be attacked again by the British Empire at some point in the future. And so, we had to be able to produce our own goods, our own material goods. And it sounds strange in the modern era, but like you actually controlling some portion of your own production is freedom, right? Because you're no longer reliant upon foreign institutions and outsiders to produce your own goods, especially war material. That's why we have a defense industry, right? But secondarily to that, especially commercial consumer goods, these things allow you to have political autonomy from other countries. Like Canada is not that autonomous from the United States because it relies on the United States for so much of their own things, and it's probably never can actually be like autarkic for a reason. But and it's not a system of autarky, which is the American system of political economy. It's this concept that for the most part, we're better off making our own things wherever possible is the core concept. So Hamilton wanted to create industry in the United States, manufacturing or manufacturers, as they would say back then, especially in his famous report on manufacturers. I believe it's 1789. Basically, he lays out the system for why we use tariffs, subsidies to grow industry in the United States and develop infrastructure, because the infrastructure in the United States was pathetic. And we also owned a lot of the territory up into the Mississippi River area quite very rapidly after the War of 1812. So if you're going to become a nation that can actually exert its own political will on your own nation, you have to be able to do things and build things and go places.
Boy, for the libertarians that listen to this show, this must sound like nails on a chalkboard. Like, no, the founders were for tariffs.
Absolutely.
Crazy.
Yeah. I can turn up the ASMR voice a little bit for them to make it a little bit more palatable. But they, the founders were practical. Like, you got to remember the term ideology doesn't enter the English language till the 20th century, the early 20th century, roughly after World War I. So, like, instead of being ideological, they're just normal.
Simply be normal. And this also applies to economics. Another figure that has been sort of brought into the discourse as historical examples of this worldview, giving antecedents to it, is Henry Clay. How did he picture into all of this?
So Henry Clay was kind of the student of Hamilton that Hamilton never met. There's a very interesting thing with the American system of political economy where a lot of these people actually never met each other, but they're fans from a distance. Mm-hmm. So Henry Clay was both a U.S. senator and the Speaker of the House. Very, very influential person. Probably one of the most influential men in American history who never became president. He decided elections. He decided a lot of things. He tried several times to become president, did not get to do so. So Henry Clay was when he was born, his family had a slave or two. And when he became an adult and took over the family estate, he freed the slave. And that's really kind of his formative economic thinking, was the fact that like people should be able to own their own means of production, right? Which is, all right, so we're starting to feel the little libertarian vibe of like paying people for their work. So, but that also extends to a nation, right? Especially a developing nation that has to deal with foreign powers. And so the War of 1812 was very, very important for his development, as well as the development of his future rival, John C. Calhoun. And they became this part of this nascent nationalist movement. The United States was a very nationalistic country before Woodrow Wilson, really, or Teddy Roosevelt, I guess. That we became very nationalistic after the War of 1812. The United States actually largely is, in a way, influencer of global national movements, like talk about the unification of Italy, Germany, etc., because of what we inspired out of our own ability to buckle down and bootstrap our own nation. So Henry Clay took those ideas and refined them by Hamilton, and like created sets of policies that the United States could adhere to, both as like kind of a political rhetoric tool, but also as a practical guide. Because Hamilton kind of was more concerned with his like actual duties as Treasury Secretary, and he was killed before he could actually like do some sort of long-term project. But Henry Clay actually took the time to implement it, and especially during his tenure in the House and Senate, he was largely concerned with the growing problem of slavery in the United States. He was very anti-slavery, but the other thing that slavery also brings in is that it brings in it basically turns you into a colony, right? Because it makes it less expensive to produce cash crops as opposed to even cereals, which was the predominant crop of the North. And it basically ends up creating this subsidy and also creates a speculative market on human people, sort of like mortgage-backed securities. And what it allowed is basically this backdoor by European powers into the United States affairs. And so trying to prevent the slavery from expanding westward, the various Missouri compromises, things like that, were actually kind of this geopolitical struggle between, America, Americans and the British Empire and the French Empire. And so, and part of the way of creating this national economics, this American system of economics, it would also starve out, and it would basically strangle the slave economy by making it no longer economically feasible, because the United States would end up becoming such a manufacturing powerhouse that it would be cheaper to compensate people with dollars rather than with just food, like how slaves were actually compensated, or compensated more so. And so it was this very like high, like 4D chess, giga-brained concept of how do we deal with both the slavery problem and our and foreign influence in the United States, raising tariffs, increasing manufacturing subsidies, building railroads, and predominantly improving infrastructure in the Deep South, so it'd be easier to actually produce goods in the South, because like part of the problem with the South was it was impossible to get around.
So to back up a little bit, you talked about the United States kind of walking away from its nationalist tendencies in the early 1900s. And I think historically where we see free trade, or this ideology of free trade in the United States, but also on the right, really start to explode is during and following World War II. And China has utilized kind of a similar playbook to take a lot of the manufacturing base of the global economy. How should the United States and conservatives more broadly begin to think about these issues around free trade? I mean, it's probably not enough to just say, hey, don't do that.
Right. So there's three major time frames to get for people here listening in to understand what is actually going on with free trade. There's three. There's the Great Free Trade Crisis of the 1850s, where the slave economy really took off right before the Civil War. This is what the Henry Carey, the Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, described it, and that's when you started seeing, the Nebraska, Kansas, bleeding Kansas, and all that stuff, because of the fact that free trade actually became rampant in the United States and abroad. The second time is what's after the Great Rapprochement in the beginning of the progressivism. Most conservative Americans think that British conservatives and American conservatives are alike, and they're really not that much, as you see with Boris Johnson and continued lockdowns in the United Kingdom. The British conservatism is a free trade conservatism because it's an island nation. The United States is a national economics. Conservatism is nationalism in the United States. That's Alexander Hamilton's conservatism.
Because we span a continent and have every resource under the sun.
Right, and we're both a land power and a sea power, And then the third period was right after World War II. So right after World War II, we opened up our economy to help build the first world, this bloc that ended up becoming NATO and the various other allies against the Soviet Union. But that's also when you started seeing this mass import of British conservative ideas into American conservatism, starting with Russell Kirk. And it's really weird. Like, we could probably do a whole episode of like why you should take everything after Kirk with a little bit of salt, salt to taste. But yeah, so in terms of what happened with China, and so what happened to a lot of other countries that we had some sort of relationship with, especially wartime, they ended up just copying us, right? So when we opened up Japan, they were like, wow, these Americans have a great idea. So they actually just adopted Friedrich List, who wrote the National System of Economics, which is basically carbon copy of the American system. We physically exported that to Japan twice, second time right after World War II, as part of our occupation there. And then, you had Park Chung-hee in Korea, who literally just, when he was in Japan, he, as part of his studies in the military academy, was the military industrial complex of the United States. And so he read this stuff in the translated Japanese, and he applied that to Korea, creating, the modern Korean companies that we're familiar with today. Same thing when Deng Xiaoping became whatever they use over there, premier, prime minister, president, guy in charge of China. He literally had books on Hamilton. He had books on Lincoln. He had all these guys, the Henry Clay, Henry Carey, Friedrich List, all translated, available for their consumption to adopt these ideas and apply them in a more modern sense to China. And that's the thing. So once upon a day when I worked in finance still, a hedge fund manager once said to me and a bunch of other people that China is more like America during the Industrial Revolution than is like a country that's like in the technological revolution like we are. And he's like,
you're a developmental state.
And he didn't like to use that phrase because he's like, contextually it's different. He's like, this is a country that relies on commodities and industrial production, and it's growing towards a more modern system. But like with that like kind of planted in my brain years ago when I was still kind of like not like as like savvy on national economics as I was, comparing it to what has actually occurred today. People dunk on the Chinese about, they built new bridges to nowhere and these empty cities. It's like, well, they have affordable housing now, and also they can build a big navy. Like that's really the thing. It's like you can get around the country on car or train now pretty easily, more easily than parts of the United States. And now they're going to transition that heavy steel manufacturing and parts that would build a building or a bridge into making ships and becoming a dominant sea power. And that's the thing, is these things have trickle down effects on each other. The knock-on effects actually is probably a better word, because your ability to produce things is your ability to produce things. Your ability to be a service economy is great, but what happens when they figure out how to remote your job overseas?
Yeah.
then you actually have no institutional knowledge built up.
He said trickle down, and I like started sweating.
Yeah,
It's kind of feeling a little gross.
It's
now.
funny. There's even a modern analog to the fact that these East Asian regimes were importing Hamilton and List and all these folks. I've been told on reliable information that American Affairs is a very popular quarterly in China, that they have a lot of readers out there because because
That's
it
epic.
turns out that when you have a good idea, you can use it.
Well, that's the thing about the ideology point I made earlier, is that if you have pure ideological thinking towards things, then you become, neocons or libertarians or like neolibs or whatever the flavor of like the Democrat version is. Or if you're practical and realistic, like you can call yourself a communist, but like apply the things that American founding fathers thought were like just common sense policies in your country.
Right.
Yeah, I'm for good things and against bad things.
That's right.
Generally, no ideology, just that.
Right. It's like, strive to be aggressively normal.
Yeah. In all things. Pivoting a little bit, your most recent position that you held before you transitioned to the private sector was in the Census Bureau and then in the U.S. Treasury Department. You wrote a fantastic piece after you left government about what went down at the Census Bureau when you were there. You caused a little bit of a stir. Tell us why you pissed in people's cornflakes.
So there's going to be some more cornflakes, I don't want to accidentally swear. So like I'll be ruffling a few more feathers pretty soon too. But so the problem, so when I got to Census Bureau, I thought, oh, this is Census Bureau. I work there already. This is cool. Like, this is great. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, this is not great. This is literally the deep state. So one of the big problems the Republican Party has is that we actually have we basically have no experts on things like the census. And this is partly because the 1990s reduction in payroll for congressional staff, right? We basically have very few experts in the field, and the Democrats are willing to spend private dollars on private experts.
But we're really good at school choice, Adam.
Oh, exactly. Well, school choice is actually a really good example of like just punting on like the issue of like schools. Like the school, like driving people to run for school board is one of the greatest things that has happened in terms of ideas, for education reform, because that's actually an idea and that's a policy agenda, and you can drive policy. School choice, like a lot of the charter schools are pretty liberal. A lot of private schools in New York City are extremely liberal. So it's like, okay, we're not really getting anything done there. But with the Census Bureau is like remarkably liberal, remarkably political. It's supposed to be quote unquote an independent agency, but it's really actually not legally an independent agency. It actually falls under the purview of the Secretary of Commerce at the Commerce Department. So politicals actually have supervisory authority there. And so once we were there, there's all sorts of things that the Census Bureau just does without ever really asking substantial permission. And Congress is kind of unaware that they're doing. So there's a variety of issues. In my article, I talked about group corps imputation. So imputation is where they basically use an educated guessing tool to guess how many people live in a household based off of when they don't respond to it. Now, they do have some caveats where they try to zero out certain houses based off of a reasonable rate of like empty households. But, you really can't tell 100% sure. So they say on a large enough scale, they actually it's pretty accurate. But there's no post-imputation survey to actually double check to see if anybody actually lived there. And there's a Supreme Court case, Utah versus Evans, that upheld imputation as a method that the Secretary of Commerce can use to do the census, to make sure that numbers are counted accurately.
Yeah. Very concretely, this is, you have houses A, B, and C. Houses A and C, fill out their census form every 10 years and send it in, but house B does not. And so based on kind of sort of what the neighborhood looks like and what house A and C are, the Census Bureau just guesses. There's 5 people who live here. They're African American, and there you go.
Right. And that the thing though that it gets really funky though once you start looking at it. So they try to match numbers to the most similar household by size and characteristic. But if you have no characteristics inside the household, you're basically doing it purely off size. So, things get really weird once you start talking about where imputation largely occurs. It largely occurs in very rural areas and very urban areas, which tend to have the least, they tend to be the most extreme on the bell curve. They're most dissimilar from everything else in the middle. And especially in rural areas, you have household sizes that are going to be completely radically different.
Mm-hmm. It could be one old grandpa on a farm. It could be 14 children.
Exactly. Yeah. And then same thing with cities, right? Like I remember when I was in Flushing, Queens, there was like little shanty towns on some of these apartment buildings of like illegal apartments. It's like, how do you count those?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Are they even apartments or are they just like shacks that people built up on top of the roof? I have no idea. Like there's weird things that happen in some of these places. So like that's why the founders, the framers of the Constitution, they actually wanted a census person to actually hand count every single person, just because there's all sorts of shenaniganry and variety that actually does occur. But what ended up happening in this census because of COVID panic, lockdowns, and just the general resistance to Trump, the Census Bureau tried to rewrite their own timeline. But the Constitution has no force majeure, which means like you can't just blow through a timeline without approval from Congress, right? There's never going to be approval from Congress on the census because the state constitutions have primacy over redistricting, right? They will win in court if you do that. So like the Census Bureau had to get it done. So we had to force the Census Bureau, first of all, to actually do its job, which they didn't. They refused. They basically went kicking and screaming, of course. The second part is when you get to group quarters. Group quarters are facilities that people live in that they typically receive a service, like dorms, jails, military bases, and nursing homes are like the prime examples of it. Well, so military bases can enumerate themselves, count their people themselves. Jails and prisons generally also do too. So what you're actually talking about is dorms and nursing homes and facilities like those, right? And so what happened in the census was 1 in 5 of these group quarters overall did not report numbers at all. Pause intentionally. Then you had, so 1 in 5 of them didn't do it, and they're mostly heavily weighted towards dorms and nursing homes. All right, so things are starting to get weird. I see like people's, your eyes start like, wow, this is some wild stuff. So Stephen Moore wrote an article, where did the Census Bureau get 2.5 million people in deep blue states in the Northeast? Well, I don't know if they actually got 2.5 million people. Like I can't see like the numerical process, but they could definitely have shaved extra people into those numbers just through imputation, because what they did was this thing called group quarters imputation. First of all, so the AP said that this is a rare thing that occurs, and it never happens in group quarters or something to that effect. I apologize if I get it wrong, because Mike Schneider will correct me, of course. But that's actually not true. The Census Bureau has done group quarters imputation in the past, and it hasn't been challenged. But so with 1 in 5 facilities floor that didn't report, and the fact that nursing homes and dormitories tend to be fairly dissimilar from each other, it's extremely hard to do an apples to apples comparison. So if you have a house block where A through Z, where house A and house M are identical, like you can actually make the Census Bureau's argument is you can make a reasonable assessment within a margin of error that they're going to have the same amount of people in them. But with nursing home facilities, wildly different sizes, wildly different demographics. A lot of nursing homes don't share the demographic makeup of their actual neighborhood, mm-hmm. etc. You're actually shooting into the wind, and because there's no actual method for you to do an apples to apples comparison, you have to invent a way to do it. You have to go reverse engineer it, and this is where I start saying you have to use a linear regression to do it. I also know some things about the census, but basically what they did was this: they created probably a linear regression model of like trying to accurately assess how many people should have been in these nursing home facilities, for example, or dormitories on April 1st, 2020. That's actually statistical sampling, according to the Supreme Court. Both in the Utah versus Evans case, which is the most important case in the census here, Breyer and also O'Connor, who Breyer wrote the majority decision. O'Connor wrote probably the best of the dissenting opinions. Scalia and somebody else also dissented. But O'Connor, they both Breyer and O'Connor actually made statistical arguments, and both of them agree what statistical sampling is. And linear regression would actually be a statistical sample, because you're actually taking a base sample and applying it to an unknown rather than a known to a somewhat known, right? There's not enough constraints here. And so, where do the numbers come from? Well, one of the arguments that this is going to bring up is that you need 760,000 people to create a new congressional district. Not true. Even though that's the average representation of it, you only need a few thousand people in each of these states where there's heavy imputation to actually change apportionment for another state. It's because these states are actually rank ordered based off the apportionment formula. So anything that knocks down a state by some in the ranking order and increases another, or just like makes another one stay about the same as it would have been, basically ends up giving more seats to somebody else. And that's the thing, is imputation, normal imputation tends to favor blue states over red states. And it tends to favor specifically blue areas over red areas in states. So like the rule argument is saying like, oh, it helps Republicans is on its face actually just false. It's not Republicans answer the census. Democrats tend to not answer the census. It's very bizarre social trends. And plus also with all the racial agitation the media does, they actively encourage that to not happen. And then there's the other problem with imputation. So group corps imputation is probably against the rules. It should be challenged. There's FOIAs out there trying to get the information on it. I hope that someone's able to actually crack the case so that there's some sort of action can be taken on it, because the Census Bureau should not be doing group corps imputation. Census Bureau should be compelling these places to at least enumerate themselves if they can't do it because of COVID lockdowns. That aside, regular imputation is a problem. Like, so one of the things that's referenced in imputation documents out there, and I'm sorry, this is getting a little too technical.
No, this is really good.
But where's the basis of imputation, right? And so it's really hard to figure it out because not a lot of census documents talk about it. But the ones that are interesting are whenever like NAACP or other organizations sues the census. And because then the census has to defend itself. And so in NAACP of Prince George's County versus the Census Bureau, I think they sued the director, Steve Dillingham at the time. I believe. I could be wrong. The lawyers for the government actually mentioned a population estimate of why they think the imputed numbers of Prince George's County in 2010 were actually reasonably accurate based off of population estimate. And that's insane because that's also statistical sampling. So are you justifying imputation based off of a statistical sample, or are you doing imputation because of some sort of thing that's a priori important about statistical the information? And this becomes a question of epistemology, of like knowledge of your ability to know things. And the Census Bureau does all sorts of really clever ways to avoid saying that they actually just don't know something. And it's fine to say you don't know. That's the point of these methods. The question is like, are you applying these unknowns to unknown unknowns, or are these known unknowns, or what's the structure of these things? So the other issue with the census, and this actually recently just came out, well, actually there's multiple other issues, but is the differential privacy. Differential privacy is this algorithm which blurs the lines of these census block tracts by moving people outside of where they're actually reported on locations. And the idea is that basically with supercomputers, you can actually identify people with public and free information combining with the census. So they scramble this numbers, but the problem is these are numbers that have to be used by both demographers, the states, the counties, also the federal government for appropriations. Also, they need to be able to determine the boundaries for congressional districts and state house and state senate districts, as well as a variety of other places. And so you're actually making these things intentionally not accurate by doing so. And so basically, we have a new problem that we've never faced before, is that these borders of these congressional districts are not going to be accurate just because of differential privacy. This is actually a passion project by one of the assistant directors there. This is like kind of his magnum opus before he retires, and he's trying to make a big name for himself. But this has a bipartisan opposition. Actually, the opposition's way stronger on the Democrat side because they can just have the experts to do it. But no one wants this. Members of Congress don't want this, and there's been no real challenge to it. And the Biden administration has just rubber stamped it through for some reason, and partly because they probably don't understand it either. And this is going to be a huge problem. And meanwhile, in HR 4, I believe it is, they actually have this provision there that you wouldn't be legally able to challenge the borders of minority and majority districts under some law or provision that they put into it. Which the problem is with that is that if there's some sort of inaccuracy because of the census creating inaccuracy, you're basically not allowed to sue or have recourse for this inaccuracy because of this law. And so part of me, my spidey senses start tingling. It really gets the noggin jogging. It's like, who else knows that the Census Bureau is kind of creating this situation where it stacks odds against Republicans. And why is this? Because the census was going to turn out really, really, really bad for the Democrats. Because of urbanization, variety of other factors going on, the Trump revolt, the Trump Republican Reformation, the places that were typically more purple are getting more red, and these deep blue districts are getting deeper blue. And so what ended up happening is you probably you could see a permanent clean sweep of the House and Senate till 2032. And so that's what this is. This is the great crisis of this, is that these guys are intentionally applying methodologies to intentionally affect the election. Everybody talks about the problems of the popular vote. To nullify even the normal electoral college, you just change a little bit of marginal policy here and marginal policy there. Rhode Island was within a few 10,000 people, then they would have lost a seat. They probably would have lost it to Texas if I did my math correctly. And this is actually a serious issue. This is about everything. This is straight constitutional issues. This is about the deep state. This is some high tier combination of how should we run our government? How should we have a Republican a domestic policy agenda? How should we have a bipartisan agreement on anything? This is a place where we can have bipartisan agreement on. This is a lot of things that culminate into this one issue. And the problem is that other than Hans von Spakovsky at Heritage and maybe Mike Gonzalez at Heritage, there's really not a lot of people who have even touched this in the professional academic sense. It's me and two other people from the Census Bureau, and they're on the outs. I'm the closest thing to a political insider that has it. So I'm evangelizing the issue, but I'm concerned we'll actually never have any recourse on any of this stuff, or at least even crack open the lid, see if I'm right. I'm happy to be wrong. I'd prefer to be wrong, because this would be horrible if we're wrong.
Well, and it seems like this, like the framework you just laid out, where there's this enormously politically consequential issue that requires deep expertise that is fundamentally controlled by the administrative state, is reflected in every single department and every single agency across the federal government. And that Republicans and conservatives have been asleep at the wheel for the last 40 years in terms of developing the skill sets that you would need in order to have a fighting chance of actually influencing this stuff. And so, I mean, where else did you see versions of this in the administration? I mean, it seems like it was everywhere.
Yeah, so the Treasury Department also has its problems, but Treasury Department's run is a little bit different than most departments because of the fact that we have so much access to a lot of like very important things, and it's one of the I can't remember the British term for it. It's one of the top tier departments. It's one of the more prestigious places to be. There's actually a British term for it that's really, really good that we should. That's one of the few things we should import from the British system. So like you saw that a lot of times because how do you become somebody who wants to be a top level career Treasury Department person? Well, you went to the right schools, you have the right resume, right credentials, you say the right things, and you go right in. Like, you know, the same thing happens with military promotions, except for military promotions, at least at the very bottom, are much more reflective of the actual general population. You know, towards the top, it breaks off, but you have to find somebody who gets their PhD at a top 5, top 10 economics program, for example, who don't want to work on Wall Street, you know, and wants to cap out their maximum salary at $150,000 a year, potentially in 10 to 20 years from then. That's a certain kind of person. The Republican Party just doesn't elevate those types of people to begin with. And secondly, like we have this culture, we have a really, in terms of public policy, we have a really bizarre culture, and I kind of blame, you know, some of the reforms of the 90s that on this were really kind of dissuaded Republicans from engaging in hardcore policy. There's too much consolidation among the think tanks to particular focus areas rather than actually having broad-based domestic policy agendas. There's a lot of places that you can put blame on, but is that like we don't actually talk very much policy issues. The Democrats have a really strong bifurcation and kind of allocation of work and resources. There's people who do explicitly policy. There's people who do explicitly politics. People do stuff in between. They have huge amounts of people who are capable at any given time to actually render opinions that are substantial and legitimate on different issues for any side that take of it. Like even was it DSA, the Democratic Socialists, Social Democrats, whatever they're called. They even have people who are policy wonks who can comment on it. Like I think saw a tweet by Ryan Gerdusky about this actually, where like there's all these progressives who actually like hardcore radical progressives who actually got appointee positions because they actually knew how to play the game. They got their credentials in, they did the writing, you know, they're communicative, they're professional, and they got into these various positions as personnel as policy. And it's you know, that's something we just refuse to learn for some reason. We don't reward our own. We don't actually elevate them to positions of influence, and we punt on a lot of domestic policy issues so that we can try to win some sort of agreement on things. But you have to. One of the things with government is you have to be explicit about what you want. You have to actually write it into law. You have to write it into policy, because if you keep being implicit about it, then it can be interpretive, right? And that's the thing, is that's what the American system of political economy is. It's an explicit affirmation of what we value and who we value.
Yeah.
Americans. And same thing with the policy agenda on the Hill, in the executive branch. You have to say what you mean, and you have to write it down. You can't just like do this like ethereal appeasement towards ambiguous American values. You actually have to say what the value is, you know. And the same thing, there has to be some real thought put into place. Otherwise, you know, it won't matter whether or not we can win elections or not, because like the Democrats still just get their way, because we just refuse to engage in normal politics.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem to be part of the systemic problem on the right, and thankfully there were a few good men like yourself in the administration that learned this lesson in a hard way, and in many ways inspire the work we're doing here at American Moment. Real quick, Adam, where can people keep up with you, see what you're writing, see what you're saying, and learn more?
So my Twitter handle is @RealAdamK. I don't expect anyone to spell my last name for them. And that's really the only place I'm at other than wherever I write. So I've been seen in American Spectator, The American Mind, Revolver, so far. So
that's fantastic. Well, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for everything you do.
Thank you for having me.
This week, to point out some pieces on AmCanon, I just want to really encourage all of you to go and look at the pieces that we referenced during the episode. Adam has written fantastic pieces, specifically at Revolver News, about Hamiltonian economics. He has some coming out about the Afghanistan withdrawal, and he's written a fantastic piece on the census at the American Mind as well. Would encourage you to check out all of them and his writing in general. Again, he's a rare example, but a perfect example of the sort of thing that American Moment wants to do at scale, which is creating people who are relentless subject area experts, who have a mind towards public service, who are ultimately not going to make as much money as they would in the private sector. And Adam could make a ton of money in the private sector, but are going to be part of what prevents this country from sliding into darkness. He is a wealth of knowledge. Again, really make sure that you take a look at those pieces on AmCanon, and be sure to subscribe and share this podcast with friends of yours. If you're a Hill staffer and you thought that, dang, that was really interesting about the Census Bureau, maybe I'm going to get my boss to go file a bill about it. Great. Send it to every other Hill staffer you know as well. If you rate and subscribe 5 stars and write a review with a question in it, we'll be sure to answer it on the show. And always send in feedback at podcast@americanmoment.org. We love to, every time I meet with someone in DC and they happen to mention they're a podcast fan, I always ask them, I say, I won't be offended, what actual feedback do you have? And it's mostly positive, but we have tweaked certain things accordingly based on the feedback we get. So please don't be a stranger. Send those 5-star reviews in, and we'll see you next week on Moment of Truth. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.